Hi everyone, Kate here with another Victober video for you. So I wanted to do a video today for you about sensation novels, and I went into this, wanting to do some research for it and not knowing exactly how much would be out there on sensation novels. And then 5 hours later, after reading many scholarly articles, I have a lot to tell you, and I am really looking forward to it. So just to get, right out the gate, for those of you that might not know what a sensation novel is, the term sensation means something really shocking or unusual that would have happened in society then. So there are some common plot devices like bigamous marriages, murder, and I'll talk about more in the upcoming parts of the video. And so it was just really kind of revolutionary, and I'll unpack it more as I get through more of the information. But I would argue that sensation novels were the thriller of the Victorian era, and I like them better than thrillers. Spoiler alert. So I think that also why I really like them. As opposed to some Victorian literature, I enjoy the more literary things like George Eliot or Gaskell or the Brontes. But I turn to sensation novels when I kind of want the TV sitcom reading of Victorian novels. That's as much focus as it takes. It's really quick, they're pacey, they keep moving, and I love that about them. And then even a step further, the Penny Dreadful, I would say, is reality television. So I will talk about Penny Dreadfuls right at the end of the video. But I have some quotes I wanted to read to you about sensation novels. One, someone said that they are electrifying the reader. They play on the nerves and thrill the senses. Punch magazine, which was a very popular magazine, it said they are harrowing the mind, making the flesh creep, causing the hair to stand on end, giving shocks to the nervous system, destroying conventional moralities, and generally unfitting the public for prosaic avocations of life. And Lynn Pikett says in her book, she has a book called The Sensation Novel, that they are the quintessential novel with a secret. I love that little nugget definition. They are a novel with a secret. Then in the introduction to Lady Audley's Secret, I really liked it, said, "What do we know of the mysteries that may hang about the houses we enter? Foul deeds have been done under the most hospitable roofs. Terrible crimes have been committed amid the fairest scenes, and have left no trace upon the spot where they were done. I believe we may look into the smiling face of a murderer and admire its tranquility." Thomas Hardy said that they were a long and intricately inwrought chain of circumstance. And so I think when people have looked back, they have really seen the Gothic novel as the source to sensation novels. So authors like Anne Radcliffe, that's mentioned a lot in Jane Austen's book Northanger Abbey, and also Matthew Lewis, who wrote The Monk. Those are really famous authors of Gothic novels. There are many out there, but I didn't do that much research into Gothic novels themselves. But the reason why sensation novels were so sensational is that they were a violent yoking of romance with domesticity, romance with a capital R, and realism. All of those things put together. And so traditionally, these were two really different styles of book. You wouldn't have a romantic book also be combined with realism in the same book. It just wasn't done. And for the first time, it was done with sensation novels. So it infused these two opposites. Someone said it infused opposites, possible and improbable, solidly English and exotic, sordid and yet respectable, refined yet violent, scientific yet superstitious. They were civilized melodramas, and that's from The Maniac in the Cellar by Winifred Hughes. And so these books were really a hybrid of domestic and exotic. Gothic novels had a lot of the same sensational aspects like murder and bigamy, and different devices that aren't coming to mind right now, but I'll talk about them later in the video. But they always had an exotic setting to them. So it was for the first time in sensation novels that it was in the everyday domestic setting. That was a really big deal. So the three founding novels that scholars consider to be the three, founders of the genre are The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, That was published in 1860. And then East Lynne by Ellen Wood, that was published in 1861. And Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon in 1862. So then in the research I was doing, I saw that a lot of the 1860s, it was just a sensational time. There were lots of thrills for people to see, and so people were seeking thrills and entertainment in this time. So there were thrilling preachers. That may sound kind of odd, but there were some really magnetic preachers in the time. So Charles Spurgeon is a name I think a fair number of us would still know today. Just really magnetic, charismatic personality that drew people in. And then also there were stage dramas that were really frequented by a lot of the public, and a lot of the public could afford to attend them. Then public entertainments with wild animals. It would not sit well with us today, the ways that they used animals for public entertainments, and a lot of times in a way that would harm the animals, but that was something that people really sought then. And then trapeze artists became really popular, and there was a particularly famous one named London, and I'll put the campy poster up there for you. And he did a show where he walked 70 feet above the Crystal Palace, and Charles Dickens was there in the audience. And then later on, he went on to walk across Niagara Falls on a wire, which is just terrifying to me. And then also a big deal was that railway travel increased, and at railways they started to have book stalls, and sensation novels began to be sold at these book stalls. Also, in addition to that, the absence of stamp duty. Stamp duty was a tax that newspaper companies, publication houses had to pay. And that was abolished by a law that was passed in 1855. And so the cost of newspapers steadily decreased. So a lot of the public that prior to this couldn't afford newspapers could now afford them. And in addition to that, public education increased, and so more people had the ability to read, and so wanted to read these really pulpy stories. So they were a phenomenon from 1860 to 1880, although some sources said that it went until 1890. So I think there's a little bit of debate of how long it went. And then one of the articles I was reading was saying, I don't know where it went. Where did it fade? I don't know what happened to it. But I think what happened to it is that the modern mystery novel evolved out of this. And then out of that, suspense novels and thrillers that we have today, and suspense movies. So I think we can thank the Victorian suspense novels for the wonderful films of Alfred Hitchcock, like The Birds, and Rear Window, and Psycho, which Psycho is too scary for me. And Psycho, I'd say, is less suspense, but I digress. So then also, it's interesting to think about the influence you can see on Victorian authors that aren't considered sensation novelists, like George Moore, who I haven't read any of yet, but Robert Louis Stevenson, he has a lot of the plot elements that they do that he uses in his books. And also even Thomas Hardy, who's considered a very literary author. And I don't think it doesn't have to be this false dichotomy of either you have these pulpy plots or you have literary writing. I think you can have both. And so an aspect that made them so enticing to readers is that they could be going on all around you and you wouldn't notice it. It sort of was a haunting kind of phenomena. So a note about thrillers, modern day thrillers. And I've read maybe between a half dozen and 10 in the past 5 years. And the thing to me about thrillers is that they don't have this sustained tension building. It seems very, very heightened for the vast majority of the book. And so I'm so exhausted by the end of the book that it's just too instant gratification. There was another quote I saw that said, sensation novels have the art of drawn out mystification or impending menace. And I love that delayed gratification of the information, what is going to happen. And so I'm so compelled to keep reading. And also a note about modern thrillers that I am so tired of sex and violence against women being used as plot devices. And it's in so many of them. And I don't know why more authors don't try to branch out of that. Another remarkable thing about sensation novels is that it took the psychology that you get into in a book, into the characters' heads, to a whole extra level. We can thank Jane Austen for free and direct discourse. It was a totally revolutionary kind of way to write where you get in on the character's thoughts. You know, it will say Marianne was walking around the cottage. She couldn't believe her family had had to move here and she felt so lonely. That was really a new technique. And then you take it even more to the nth degree in sensation novels. You're getting in on the characters' innermost fears and the thoughts as they pave their way through the sinister plots, kind of what will happen next to them. And it's really an effective tool to make you really root for the characters that are in it. And also there were innovative narrative techniques, like having multiple narrators. That was a really big deal, and I think it's utilized really well in books like The Woman in White and in The Moonstone, although I think The Moonstone maybe by some isn't considered a sensation novel. And then, yes, so it's called split or shared narrative. So an interesting thing that I hadn't thought about before, in modern horror novels, you see they'll take fears of the day that people have and capitalize on that and use it as a device. Well, the sensation novel was no different. It capitalized on the fears of the day. So the fears that they had: sickness, insanity. We know that women being sent off to asylums was an all too common thing. Identity theft, family secrets, this idea that if something came out of the woodwork, it could ruin and tarnish your family's reputation forever, is a really big deal. And surface level respectability, going right along with the family secrets, that someone can put on this persona that they are so morally upright and it could all be a lie. And also gender roles are really played with in sensation novels, because that was something, you know, feminism and suffragettes, suffragists, depending on where you're from, were slowly coming on the rise towards the later of the Victorian era. So you can see it was something that people were really grappling with in that time. So I thought that was really interesting and something I hadn't connected, from modern day techniques that authors use to back to the Victorian era. So there are all of these ways, that Victorian traditionalists could comfort themselves about the world and their framework, and sensation novels just really pulled the rug out from under that. These assumptions that you have about women, about marriage, about good appearances. And so it also is interesting to think about that. It could show that there was a craving for change in Victorian society, that people wanted things to change and weren't content with things how they were, certain aspects of it. And it really is a sign of the things to come. So I was curious to see the list of popular authors, and one was Mary Elizabeth Braddon, then Wilkie Collins, and Ellen Wood. So I have read all of those authors, but then the rest of the authors I haven't read, and many of them I had not heard of. William Black, Henry Kingsley, Ouida. Ouida is one that I had heard of. It was a female sensation novelist, and her stories sound really haunting. So at some point, I do want to try her. James Payn, Charles Reade. I have heard of Charles Reade, and he sounds extra intriguing after reading up about him. Edmund Yates. And then George William MacArthur Reynolds, who apparently is the most widely read Victorian author. So I don't know how do you measure who's the most widely read? Because it's not saying best-selling, but I'm really intrigued by that, to know that he's the most widely read. So then there are, of course, going to be critics of any new phenomena, and Henry Mansell was a very outspoken critic, and he called them newspaper novels. And the author Margaret Oliphant also was a critic, and she said these novels were creeping upwards from the gutter to the drawing room. And one thing that made me laugh so much, Punch magazine apparently referred to Lady Audley's Secret as Lady Disorderly's Secret. And then the Times, the newspaper, criticized Charles Reade's book, A Terrible Temptation. It was published in 1871. And Reade responded with, "I'm merely dramatizing facts reported by the Times." And that is a really good point. The Times, it's easy for them to critique that. They don't have any skin in the game. The press doesn't. They can just kind of slander him. But he points out, you guys are making money off murder trials too. Like, I'm just reporting what is in there. So who are you to criticize me? And I did neglect to mention also earlier that another thing that really contributed to the popularity of sensation novels was the fact that murder trials were being reported really frequently and sensationally in the newspapers because newspapers had become so cheap and the public were really, really fascinated by them. There were some really iconic ones, but I don't want to go into any detail about them because I just find true crime, I don't like to spend lots of time researching that. But there were some really famous, iconic murder cases that were very closely followed by the press. And interestingly enough, Anthony Trollope did not like the distinction between sensation and realistic fiction. He said that any great novel should have both. I was surprised to hear that from Anthony Trollope because his books do seem very like upright and proper, but I like that that he made that distinction. And he said, you know, my good friend Wilkie Collins. So he kind of came to the defense of sensation novelists. And then something that I would love to get my hands on, but I don't know if I can. Apparently, Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan, W.S. Gilbert, wrote a comic opera spoof of a sensation novel called A Sensation Novel in 3 volumes. And I tried to find a recording of it, and I can't find it anywhere. There was like a used VHS for sale from 1987, and I don't have a VHS player, but I would just love to get my hands on a recording and know what a Gilbert comic opera spoof of a sensation novel would be like. And so then we move into Penny Dreadfuls. So for those of you that saw my TBR, I have Wagner the Werewolf on there, and I was surprised to hear, I thought Penny Dreadfuls came out the same time as sensation novels, but apparently they started coming out in the 1830s, and they were at first called periodicals, and sometimes boys' periodicals, because they were a lot aimed at children, which I didn't realize. But then the public was really, kind of affronted by a lot of the salacious content in them, and so they gave them the nicknames of Penny Awfuls, Penny Bloods, and Penny Dreadfuls. So they were kind of stories of adventure, also revenge fantasy, which I had to think about that for a minute. Like, what is the genre of revenge fantasy? So think Count of Monte Cristo. You know, your enemy has done all of these things. He's done you wrong all these ways. And here's your plan that you're going to take him down. Eventually they turn to crime and detection. And that is where people really took umbrage with the content of the stories. They also copied Gothic tales and took inspiration from Jacobean tragedies, macabre folktale, and other tragedies. So I will insert pictures because the pictures of Penny Dreadfuls were a really big appeal. You would buy your installment, and there would be on the first page a big half-page illustration. So Varney the Vampire is a really famous one, The Flying Dutchman, Elsa the Outcast, Black Bess, and String of Pearls. String of Pearls, a lot of us will actually know about because it was turned into the musical Sweeney Todd. And they sometimes riffed off popular works, which I love. There was one called Oliver Twist. Can you guess what one that's supposed to be based on? They typically ran for around 60 episodes. It's really interesting to think about what the contemporary authors of the day, like Dickens, what did he think of them making a Penny Dreadful of his book? And then the longest running series was The Mysteries of London, which, are you ready for how long it ran for? It ran for 12 years. That's 624 episodes. So then in the 1860s, they started focusing on children. And The Wild Boys of London, The Poor Boys of London, and Work Girls of London were 3 really popular titles. And these were really campy and not highly edited. It seems like conventions, plausibility, continuity, character development, they were all optional in Penny Dreadfuls. And the reason they were called Penny Dreadfuls is because they cost a halfpenny. They were printed on extremely flimsy paper. And so that's what made them so cheap. But also, unfortunately, that is what has made them a lot of them, we don't have the full series. That's why I was surprised a couple of years ago when I was interested in reading A Penny Dreadful. I was doing research and there really aren't that many printed versions of them, because think about keeping 60 episodes together of this really flimsy paper and keeping it over such a long period of time. But when I did hear about the illustrations being such a big deal, I did look up some for Wagner the Werewolf, and so I hope you'll find them amusing like I did. And then critics said it was the literature of rascals. And then in the 1870s, even police were even raiding publishers, and newsagents and booksellers could be prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act. And then there was a rise in juvenile crimes at the same time as Penny Dreadfuls. And so the Penny Dreadfuls began to be blamed for it. And I think, what do I think? There's a lot of kind of scoffing at the people who say there's a link between violence and youth and video games, but I don't think it should be written off altogether. There were a lot of really sad examples in the article I read on Penny Dreadfuls of, this one young man who committed suicide, and he was all alone and found in his room with like 50 different Penny Dreadful stories that he had kept them all. And so I think if you're going to be surrounding yourself with stories of death and that's all you're reading, I don't think it should be totally written off that maybe there was an increase in violence. And there were some really sad stories that I read about boys doing things really reminiscent of the Penny Dreadfuls, of the characters in Penny Dreadfuls that they had read. So I do think, it seems like that I don't like that there was an Obscene Publications Act, like that. But I thought the article was a bit cavalier, just kind of writing that off. Well, if, all of a sudden there's this huge rate of juvenile crime, it's really easy to say 150 years later, like, oh, that's so ridiculous that they did that. But when you're in it, when you're living in it, it doesn't feel ridiculous to try to really fix these high rates of juvenile crime. I had a fabulous time looking into the history of sensation novels, and there are several more authors now that I want to try. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned some new things. Let me know if you have a sensation novel that you love, that you think I haven't read and you would like me to read. And if you don't have a recommendation for that, please tell me your favorite sensation novel. And I will be back with another video soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.